In this section, What Do They Know? The Power of Discussions and Conversations, we will be focusing on a very critical way, an important way we can gather information about what students know and don't know. Our focus is going to be using various oral assessment strategies during this informative assessment process. So keep in mind that we've talked about the importance of clear learning targets, and now we're going to talk about different tasks, questions, and assessments in which we can determine what students know and don't know towards these clear learning targets. So keep in mind that we're really blurring the lines between instruction and assessment. So you'll notice that as we have discussions, these discussions and conversations happen within and throughout our daily activities. So before we go any further, I want you to just think and reflect. What oral assessment strategies do you currently use to determine what students know and don't know related to those specific learning targets? As we move on to oral assessment strategies, keep in mind that there is not one single best method. Different assessment methods reveal different kinds of information. So let's take a look at discussions as a way to assess and determine student understandings. Informal conversations are a big part of what we do throughout our day. Conversations often make us aware of students' misunderstandings by accident. Oftentimes, as we question and really listen to students, we see their misconceptions. And students can be much like mirrors, reflecting back what we say and do, but not really understanding why or how. If we focus on understanding student thinking during our conversations, we become more certain about our inferences. Conversations allow so many opportunities for the teacher to learn about and understand student thinking. So truly, these conversations go beyond answer getting, but really give us some insight into student thinking. So let's take a look at a few scenarios illustrating discussions. So in this particular situation, the lesson was relating times 10 to times 5. So Mrs. Sievertson said, Noah, what strategy do you use to figure out 5 times 7? So this was the question she posed. And Noah said, I know that 10 times 7 is 70, so 5 times 7 will be half as much because it is half as many groups of 7. Also, I know that when the minute hand is on the 6, it is 30 minutes past, so 7 groups would be 35. Notice in this example that Mrs. Sievertson, by asking the question about his strategy, really could see the flexible thinking and reasoning that Noah had about the relationship between multiplying times 10, which was easy for him, along with times 5, using that related fact. In this example of identifying right angles, Mr. Smith said, Leah, you mentioned it was a left angle. What do you mean by a left angle? And Leah responded, the lines from the corner go like this. And she holds her arms to show a right angle, but turns herself so that one hand is pointed to the left. Left angles are the same as right angles. They just go the other way. In this scenario, Mr. Smith discovered Leah's misconception relating to right angles and their orientation in space. So oftentimes, by asking questions and listening and having students articulate their strategy or their understanding, we can get to the misconception. In this example, Mr. Smith says, Connor, which is greater, 1/4 or 1/5? During this discussion, Connor says 1/4 is greater than 1/5. And Mr. Smith leads back with, can you explain your thinking? Which is just a great simple question to ask that is very open-ended. And Connor says, well, 5 is greater than 4, so 1/5 is greater than 1/4. Through this informal conversation, it is evident that Connor is using whole number concepts when comparing fractions. He is not understanding that fractions are about the relationship between the numerator and denominator. This teacher realizes that this is a common misconception. So, Mr. Smith was very intentional about asking this question. So, planning this question because he wanted to dig deep to this misconception. Now, you can see a couple models on the screen. As Mr. Smith would probe more deeply, he might ask Connor to draw a visual representation of these two fractions and then continue discussing how do we know and can you prove it, to help Connor get to understanding this misconception that he has. Unplanned brief conversations with individual students within day-to-day routines can uncover misconceptions. We must be good listeners, paying attention to statements by our students that alert us to the need for further conversations with them. We must be good listeners, paying attention to statements by our students that alert us to the need for further conversations with them. By listening carefully, we may also find that they know more than they can record with traditional symbolic notations, for example. So as I said before, those visual representations or using manipulatives to help them justify and explain really helps them with their conversations and their discourse. Oftentimes, we know in the math world that those concrete pictorial representations are a really important part of what we do in math. But what I've come to realize is those also serve as a model and a conversation tool for them to show, point, utilize while they're explaining and discussing their thinking. So let's consider whole class discussions for a moment. During class discussions, you listen for students thinking beyond the right answers. What we learn from class discussion often guides our moment-to-moment decisions about what to do next. Creating good questions and intentional tasks or problems really lend themselves to good class discussions. And also, as we think of class discussions, we're thinking about what are our targets and what do they know and don't know, and then those moment-to-moment decisions about instructional steps are made. So research over and over again has proven the value of math discourse. So let's take a look. Here you're going to see just a number talk example. And a number talk is a short routine in which you pose a computation problem and we have students respond with their strategy, and they do this mentally. And here, typically students are gathered on the carpet as a whole class, pose the problem. They put a thumb up if they have a strategy. If they have more than one strategy, they put another finger up and so forth. Here, what I want to point out is this short routine really provides some good insights into strategies that these students have in relationship to two-digit addition. Oftentimes, when I do number talk examples, if students aren't bringing specific strategies to the number talk, that's a formative check for me. This is a class discussion that lets me know where I have some teaching points in regards to strategies. So just one example. Here's another great example you could do as a class discussion. Which shapes are correctly partitioned into fourths, and how do you know? So as you perhaps have students pair share, discuss what they think, and then come back together as a whole group, what a great discussion that will help you get a formative assessment check on where they are with partitioning. If they have some common misconceptions that as long as there's 4 pieces, whether they're equal or not, they're fourths. So once again, you can see this is a well posed question with visual representations of various types that really lends itself to a strong discussion. So as we think about discussions and discourse, oftentimes show me what you think. For example, have we identified all the possible ways to combine these two shapes, for example? You could say, show me what you think. Thumbs up, thumbs down, or if you're undecided, thumbs sideways. Oftentimes I then have students pair share to justify what they showed with their thumb and their thinking, giving them some opportunities to have that discourse with a partner, and then I'm listening. I'm walking around for that minute, just hearing what kids are saying to each other. Once again, that's a great formative check. I'm gathering information to see where students are in their thinking. We come back as a whole group, and perhaps I call on someone and say, could you tell me why you put a thumbs down? What were you thinking? Can you explain another possible shape you think we could make, for example? So that whole show me what you think with your thumb, and then explain and justify your thinking. Really simple way. I think a lot of us use thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways if we're not sure or undecided. But I think it goes beyond when you not only have them show you, but then they explain. And once again, asking that good question or providing a good visual or a task is going to be really important for you to consider as you're planning. In-class interviews. Let's take a look at this idea. So when we think of interviews one-on-one, keep in mind that you can go to them while students are engaging in class activities, games, stations, independent work. Pull up a chair, have a conversation. Can you explain? How do you know? Is it reasonable? Interviews and conferences give us accurate information about student understandings and misconceptions. You need to choose targets and good questions or problems, as we've said before. Your role is really the listener and the questioner, okay? This isn't your opportunity to teach. You're having that conversation, but it is important to take clear notes so that after you're done with that interview and that conference time, you've recorded data, information, notes to help you make those next instructional steps, be it some small group work, some adjusted differentiated activities, that sort of thing. Here you can see the teacher is doing a counting assessment with a student, and it's just a one-on-one interview. Pretty quick. The student will count, point. You'll be able to see if they can answer questions of counting and cardinality, how many questions, and oftentimes these are very targeted and quick, so that perhaps in a couple days you could easily get through and check each of the students. Another great tool designed for middle school students is called the Math Reasoning Inventory, in which a problem is posed and the student needs to think about it mentally and share their way of solving. So much is revealed by these math reasoning inventory questions. I've done these with students before. It takes a little bit of time, but it really does provide valuable information in uncovering student strategies. Oftentimes collectively as a class, I also recognize where as a class we really need to focus our strategy work, and then also small group work in regards to specific strategies students don't use with efficiency. All right, so later on within this module that you're working on, the next task that you're going to have is to go in and look at the math reasoning inventory questions. And so what you will do when you get there is you'll see a drop down next to search by interview question, and that is where you're going to choose the specific questions. Choose the problem, and then you'll watch the video. Very, very enlightening. I think you'll enjoy taking a look at student thinking and strategies. So when you view these MRI interviews in the next task for this module, Really think about, what did you learn about student strategies, and did you discover any misconceptions as you listen to the students? So keep those things in mind. All right, and just a reminder once again, we really need to blur the lines of assessment and instruction. So when we think of discourse, it's not something separate that happens. Here's a K-5 math teaching resource that we utilize in our district, and it relates to fractions and making one. I think the important thing here is as they're engaging in this activity, you can see there's some good questions right within this activity provided that I would ask students as I'm walking around. How many different ways can you find to make one whole? Show me. How did you know? What strategy did you use? Really recognizing that we don't need a separate assessment, if you will, but that during the activity, those are great opportunities for conversations and discussions to happen right then and there. Really embedded discussions in a very authentic way. So, as we've talked about before early on in this course, formative assessment and questions, as we think about those, let's take a look back at James Popham's quote, "A planned process in which teachers and students use assessment-based evidence to adjust what they're currently doing." That's how he defines a formative assessment process. So as we think about that, as you're planning, you really need to be thinking about questions that are open-ended, that really get to student thinking, that also get to those specific misconceptions we know students have in that particular math concept or area. Because I think by asking the right questions, we can really have some great discussions. Also, anticipating the answers is a big part of thinking about the common misconceptions. So just keep that in mind as you continue on with this journey.